And I'll go back and mention Bill Reinert again. When Bill asked me to give this talk, I asked him, well, what would they be interested in? And he said, well, have them think out of the box. You know, give them some guidance to think out of the box and peer into the future. And down the road, as we're using hydrogen fuel cells, where is that hydrogen going to be coming from that is going to be totally renewable? So I'm going to talk about the role of high temperature concentrated sunlight to produce low carbon hydrogen. I call this the Energy Grand Challenge. And we're going to use concentrated sunlight. What if you could use sunlight to drive a very high temperature reaction where you have, I call this a magic foo-foo dust. I have a metal oxide, and I'm going to go from an iron 3 plus to an iron 2 plus, so maybe some of you took chemistry at one time. I'm going to remove oxygen as I reduce that metal. I come back and I react that reduced foo-foo dust with steam. I get pure hydrogen out. Of course, in the fuel cell vehicle, my combustion product is water. And what if, in the end game, I could use seawater or brine water, you know, brackish water, and essentially power a distillation process using sensible waste heat off of the solar plant. Now, when I look at this, you know, and the baseball season is starting up here, right? How often do you have a chance to pull off a triple play? Like, how many triple plays do you think will be made this season? Like, maybe none. Okay, so there's a real opportunity here because you can see what the triple play is. First of all, we're going to be able to make hydrogen sustainably with water and concentrated sunlight. We're also going to reduce the greenhouse gas issue because we're not using hydrocarbons. And finally, in this process, we may be able to simultaneously supply potable water that could be used for agricultural lands and also for drinking. And the point I want to make here at the end is that we're closer than you might think. Okay, so that is the message at the end, is that this is the ultimate end game, and it's not as far away as you might think it is. Now, how do we get there? And I always like, and I tell my students, that there's always a huge opportunity for innovation if you can work at the interface of two technologies. So just as an example, you know, the entire semiconductor business was founded at the interface of physics and electrical engineering. All of the biomedical, biochemical processing, it's the interface of biology, engineering, and material science. Anytime you operate at the interface of technologies, you have a huge opportunity to innovate. And so here we're looking at working at the interface of concentrated solar power and with nanomaterials. And just like thin films are driving down the price of photovoltaics, I'm going to also show you how thin film nanomaterials are also going to provide us an opportunity to use concentrated sunlight to drive reactions to split water very, very quickly. So this is a 10 nanometer bar. That's like really, really small. And what's particularly intriguing here is there's a coating. You can see a coating on these nanoparticles. And I'm not going to go into this in detail, but basically we can put perfect thin films on nanoparticles without gluing the particles together. That is absolutely incredible. And that's the technology that we're using to be able to essentially activate high surface area materials so that we can drive these water splitting reactions very, very quickly. I'm going to talk a little bit about that here in a second. So directing energy and matter, operating at the interface of CSP and nanomaterials. Now, let me also mention, I got to take this opportunity, that when you operate at the interface like this and you do research, it's very difficult to get money because the people doing this don't want money going over to these guys, and the people doing this don't want money going to these guys. So anytime you operate in an area like that, it is difficult to get funding. Okay, so you may have seen pictures of central towers, heliostat fields, and 5,800 Kelvin. The scientists understand this. This is like 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It's really hot. So the sun is a 10,000 degree Fahrenheit black body. Typically, in these concentrated solar power plants, what they do is they take water and make steam. That steam drives a turbine and makes electricity. Okay, what I'm talking about here is I'm going to have to concentrate the sunlight up further than that in order to drive these chemical reactions that require much higher temperatures. The advantage of this process is that when you use photovoltaics, you're converting sunlight to a different energy form. You're converting it to electricity and you have an efficiency loss. In these processes, I'm taking sunlight and I'm directly using that solar energy to drive a chemical reaction. I don't have any conversion to another form of energy, and that allows me to achieve very high efficiencies. How many of you, hopefully in your younger days, have done this? Where you've used a anybody do this? You guys are probably solar engineers. So you used a magnifying glass and you fried the ants, right? So the sunlight can become really, really hot. Now this is an expensive way to do it. The lower cost way to do it is using these mirrors to direct the sunlight. Now the sun, when it hits the earth, is diffuse because of the inverse square law. That's the distance between the earth and the sun. So the sun is diffused by 46,000 times. But because the solar spectrum is essentially unchanged, the sun is still 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit here on earth if we can concentrate the sunlight back up. So that's the opportunity. Concentrate the sunlight back up, make use of those temperatures, and how do you do that in a cost-effective manner? And in this particular case, we're going to drive a chemical reaction. I apologize for some of the technical aspects of this, but I want to just, there are a few points here I'm going to focus in on. This is the efficiency of sunlight to my solar reactor, to my receiver. This is 80% efficiency. Okay, so it's very high efficiency. Now, if you stand in front of a fireplace, you know you get hot from radiation losses from the fireplace, right? It's losing heat. And in fact, it's losing heat at a very high rate, at T to the 4th power. However, notice that I have this big C, this concentration in the denominator, which means that I can overcome the radiation losses from that radiating reactor by increasing the concentration of sunlight. And in fact, where I really want to operate is in this range of about 1200 to 1500 Celsius. The reason is that at 1200 Celsius, radiation heat transfer dominates the process. That's very, very fast, much faster than conduction and convection. So I want to be at high temperature so I can use radiation to my advantage. However, if I go too hot, I have a problem with materials of construction. And so in that range is really the sweet spot for operating high temperature chemical reaction processes. And notice that in order to achieve this kinds of temperature with high efficiency, I'm going to operate with a concentration of about 4,000 suns. I'm going to concentrate the sunlight up to about 4,000 times. Typically, for the steam processes that make electricity, water to steam, and power a turbine, they're running at maybe 800 suns. So we're going to concentrate the sunlight up further in order to drive these chemical reactions. And again, please understand that there's no energy conversion. We're taking that sunlight directly to drive a chemical reaction so we don't have that efficiency loss. Okay, so we do our experiments at the National Renewable Energy Lab. This is about 35 minutes away from the university in Boulder. And there's a flat heliostat that tracks the sunlight, reflects the sunlight to a primary concentrator. This primary concentrator essentially sends a collimated beam of solar radiation about 10 centimeters in diameter into the corner of this building. What you see in here on the right is a solar reactor. So my students design and build these solar reactors in the shop at the university on a skid. They put that skid in the back of a pickup truck. They drive it up the end route, and they get really excited when they put that reactor in the corner of this building, and they carry out those experiments. So if we look at what the reactor looks like, there's an opening. I'm not showing you. There's a secondary concentrator here where I can further concentrate the sunlight. The inside of this cavity could be a reflective cavity. We actually use a cavity as like a mirror that reflects sunlight. It's very inefficient, but the reason for that is that I can achieve high temperatures very quickly. I'm not worried about efficiency. The students want to get data very quickly. But in an actual process, I would have what's called an absorbing cavity here. I had insulation on the outside. And then I have multiple tubes, and I carry out chemical reactions in these tubes. And this looks like a heat exchanger that you'd have in industry. You have a bunch of tubes inside of a cavity. And there is a lot of math modeling that goes into understanding of solar physics, of how you basically heat up these tubes with sunlight coming in from that heliostat field. In this case, we have the single heliostat. So experiments are done at NREL. Now, this is the real key here. So what we can do with thin film is that we can make substrate materials that have very large pore volume on the order of 90% or greater. In other words, There's gas space in there. And then we can have walls, and I'm showing these walls to be pretty thick. This is a 1 micron bar, but we can actually make those walls on the order of nanometers thick. And we can have very large pores. And what that does is that if I want to heat this material, I can radiate across that and basically speed up my heat transfer by radiating within this medium, get very fast heat transfer rates. Because the pore volume is so large and I have such large pores, I can flow gas through that system very quickly. And if I take and I deposit a very thin layer of my magic foo-foo dust on the outside of this as a coating, and if that is now only a couple nanometers thick, I can essentially eliminate diffusional resistances for chemical reaction. So I end up with the best of all worlds. I can promote fast chemical reactions, and I also eliminate transport resistances as much as possible. Very fast heat and mass transfer rates. So the idea is to take this metal ferrite, where the M here is typically cobalt or nickel. And again, when I heat this up, I'm going from an iron 3+ state to an iron 2+ state. I remove oxygen, I come back with steam, I produce hydrogen, and I magically get this particular ferrite back. And that's the key, is to be able to recover that particular material. Okay, so this is what this looks like. So here's a larger diagram of that solar reactor. I have multiple tubes in that reactor. Half of those tubes are undergoing reduction, releasing oxygen. The other half are undergoing oxidation with steam, producing hydrogen. There is very effective heat transfer within this process. This tube may actually look like a tube bundle. I may have a bunch of tubes inside of here. I may not even have a sheath on the outside, depending on those materials of construction. These tubes can be silicon carbide, and I'm going to show you that we can actually reduce the temperatures to the point where we may be able to use metal alloys. That would be a huge advance. Now, what you're seeing down here on the right-hand corner, this is our magic foo-foo dust coated on that skeletal structure that I showed you. And right here where I have this 50 nanometer sign, this is a pore, right? So this is magnified hundreds of thousands of times. And what you're seeing is a pore inside of that with this coating, and this is the active material that ends up being reduced and then oxidized. But this is what a solar reactor looks like. Now, what I'm showing here is the reactivity. This is moles of oxygen released on a reduction step when I heat this up at these temperatures. And then this is directly related to the amount of hydrogen that I can produce as well. Now, the point that I want to make, you may have been familiar with a paper published in Science magazine. Actually, one of the co-authors was from Caltech. The other co-author was from the Swiss Federal Research Institute, the ETH in Zurich, who's a colleague of mine, and it had to do with taking Syria, reducing Syria at 1600 Celsius and carrying out this redox cycle. And it works very nicely because Syria is a very stable material. But notice that if I use this hersenite, what I call a hersenite here, I'm not going to go into the details of this, but basically what's happening here is I'm actually reacting that ferrite with the structural support. I can carry out a chemical reaction that makes that stable. I end up with a stable intermediate that allows me, when I carry out the oxidation, to get this form back. And notice that the equivalent hydrogen production would require 5 kilograms of Syria being reduced at 1600 C and only 300 grams of this particular ferrite on the alumina being reduced at 1450 C. And in fact, it's possible to produce significant amounts of hydrogen at temperatures down here below 1200 C. Now, if I can get below 1200 C, I can use high temperature metal alloys as that structural containment material. I don't need a refractory. And that is really a huge benefit because, you know, thermal shock, if you can imagine clouds going by and heating up and things, you can have thermal shock issues with some of the structural materials. And this is actually what our focus is right now.